Okay, you've heard of this substance at least once in your life, right? Heroin, the drug that older generations have been warning us to stay away from for as long as most of us can remember. But here's what almost nobody tells you. It was invented by one of the world's most trusted pharmaceutical companies, marketed as safer than the drug it replaced, and sold over the counter as medicine for children's coughs. It wasn't built to destroy lives. It was built to save them. Today, heroin is classified as having no accepted medical use in the United States and most of the world. A Schedule I substance, illegal to manufacture, sell, or possess. And yet in the United Kingdom, the exact same chemical, diacetylmorphine, is legally prescribed by the National Health Service under its clinical name, diamorphine, for severe pain in hospitals and hospice care. The same molecule sits on two opposite ends of the law, depending entirely on which country you're standing in. According to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, heroin remains one of the most trafficked and most fatal illegal drugs on Earth. Heroin's story begins not in a criminal underworld, but in a London hospital laboratory. In 1874, English chemist C.R. Alder Wright was experimenting with morphine, the powerful painkiller first isolated 7 decades earlier by Friedrich Serturner. Wright boiled morphine with acetic anhydride, a simple chemical reaction called acetylation, and produced a new compound, diacetylmorphine. He tested it on animals, noted some of its effects in his lab notes, and then largely moved on. His discovery attracted almost no attention. It sat unused and unpublished in any meaningful way for over 2 decades, a chemical curiosity rather than a breakthrough. Morphine itself was already widely used in medicine by the 1870s, but it came with a well-known problem. Physicians increasingly recognized its addictive potential, especially after decades of heavy use during and after the American Civil War, left large numbers of veterans dependent on it. The pharmaceutical industry of the late 19th century was actively searching for something to solve that problem. A painkiller as effective as morphine, but without the addiction risk. Nobody at the time understood that the compound sitting quietly in Wright's old notes might be about to become that answer, or how badly that assumption would fail. It took the German pharmaceutical company Bayer to turn Wright's forgotten compound into a global product. In 1897, Bayer chemist Heinrich Draeser resynthesized diacetylmorphine while searching for a safer alternative to morphine and codeine. Early internal testing suggested it was a highly effective cough suppressant, and by 1898, Bayer began marketing it commercially under a new brand name, Heroin, derived from the German word heroisch, meaning heroic. The marketing was aggressive and, in hindsight, almost unbelievable. Bayer promoted heroin as a safe, non-addictive alternative to morphine, suitable for treating coughs, bronchitis, and even as a general sedative. It was sold over the counter without a prescription, in cough syrups and lozenges marketed for adults and children alike. For a few years, heroin was one of Bayer's most commercially successful products, sold in dozens of countries. Physicians prescribed it widely, believing the company's claims. But those claims were false. Diacetylmorphine converts rapidly into morphine once inside the human body, and its chemical structure allows it to cross into the brain faster and more intensely than morphine itself. Rather than being a safer substitute, it was, molecule for molecule, more potent and more addictive. Reports of dependency and abuse began accumulating within just a few years of its release, and by the early 20th century, physicians and public health officials were beginning to recognize that Bayer's heroic cure had created a public health crisis of its own making. By the early 1910s, the evidence against heroin had become impossible to ignore. Physicians across Europe and the United States were reporting rising numbers of patients dependent on the drug, some of whom had been introduced to it through legitimate medical prescriptions. Facing mounting criticism, Bayer quietly discontinued production of heroin in 1913. The following year, the United States passed the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, which began regulating opiates, including heroin for the first time at the federal level, requiring registration and taxation for anyone manufacturing or distributing them. But regulation alone didn't stop the growing crisis. A full decade later, in 1924, the United States Congress passed the Heroin Act, an even stricter law that banned the manufacture, importation, and possession of diacetylmorphine entirely within the country, even for medical use, with no exceptions for doctors or hospitals. It was one of the first times a substance that had been a mainstream, legally marketed medicine was completely outlawed by name, a reversal almost unprecedented in the history of pharmaceuticals. Other countries followed similar paths in the years that followed, and by the mid-20th century, heroin had shifted from pharmacy shelves to the center of an entirely different world. Organized crime, black market production, and the beginning of the modern illegal drug trade. What had started as a legitimate chemistry experiment in a London lab, then a mass-marketed cough medicine, had within 50 years become one of the most tightly controlled and stigmatized substances on the planet. Modern pharmacology eventually explained exactly why heroin behaves so differently from the morphine it's derived from. Diacetylmorphine itself is not what produces most of the drug's effects. It functions as what scientists call a prodrug, a compound that becomes active only after the body metabolizes it. Within minutes of entering the bloodstream, enzymes in the body convert heroin first into 6-monoacetylmorphine, and then into morphine itself, the same molecule Friedrich Serturner isolated in 1804. The critical difference lies in a single added chemical feature. The two acetyl groups Wright attached during that 1874 reaction dramatically increase the compound's fat solubility. That extra fat solubility allows heroin to cross the blood-brain barrier far faster than morphine can on its own, delivering a quicker, more intense rush before converting into the same morphine molecule that then binds to the brain's opioid receptors. It's the same destination, reached by a much faster, more intense route, which is precisely what makes it more addictive and more dangerous than the drug it was designed to replace. The human cost of heroin has come in distinct waves. During the Vietnam War, a landmark study led by psychiatrist Lee Robbins found that roughly 15% of American servicemen who used heroin in Vietnam met the clinical criteria for addiction while deployed, a wartime epidemic that shocked U.S. public health officials. Decades later, a very different wave emerged. As prescription opioid painkillers became harder to obtain in the U.S., following tighter regulations in the 2010s, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention documented a sharp rise in people transitioning to heroin as a cheaper, more accessible substitute. In recent years, that crisis has deepened further as illegal heroin supplies have become increasingly contaminated with fentanyl, a synthetic opioid many times more potent, driving overdose deaths to levels U.S. Public health agencies have called a national emergency. Even today, heroin occupies a strange, contradictory place in medicine. In the United Kingdom, pharmaceutical-grade diacetylmorphine, sold under its clinical name diamorphine, remains a legally prescribed medication, used by the National Health Service for severe pain, including in palliative and end-of-life care, and in a small number of specialized clinics as a supervised treatment for severe heroin addiction itself. In nearly every other country, including the United States, the same molecule remains entirely illegal, with no accepted medical use recognized under law. Harm reduction programs, needle exchanges, supervised consumption sites, and widespread distribution of the opioid overdose reversal drug naloxone have become central to how many countries now respond to heroin use, treating it as a public health issue rather than only a criminal one. Put the two eras side by side. Before, in the early 1900s, a parent treating a child's persistent cough could walk into an ordinary pharmacy and purchase a bottle of heroin-based cough syrup with no prescription, no warning label explaining its addictive potential, and no way of knowing that the company selling it had built its marketing entirely on a false claim. A patient prescribed heroin by a trusted physician for pain, or a respiratory illness had virtually no way to know they were being given a drug more addictive than the one it had replaced, because the medical and scientific understanding to recognize that risk barely existed yet. After a patient in the United Kingdom today, receiving diamorphine in a hospice settings, is treated within a precisely regulated system, with dosing calculated by trained clinicians, monitored for effect, and administered as part of a documented, legally accountable medical protocol. Someone struggling with heroin addiction today, in many countries, can access needle exchanges, supervised treatment programs, and naloxone kits capable of reversing an overdose in minutes, tools that didn't exist for most of the 20th century. The chemical itself has not changed even slightly since Wright first synthesized it in 1874. What has changed is everything around it. The science that explains how it works, the laws that govern who can access it, and how, and the public health infrastructure built specifically to manage the consequences when things go wrong. None of this makes heroin safe. It remains one of the most addictive and lethal substances in common illegal use today, and the same molecule that can be carefully administered in a UK hospice can just as easily end a life within minutes on a city street. Wright's 1874 experiment was never meant to create a crisis. It was a routine chemistry exercise, followed decades later by a marketing campaign built on a claim nobody had properly tested. A century and a half later, the same molecule can still ease a dying patient's final days in one country and take a stranger's life in an alley in another. That contradiction was never really about the chemistry. It was about what happens when a powerful discovery moves faster than anyone's willingness to understand it.